So you may be asking yourself, why do I need to learn about exponential relationships? Well, here's why. In addition to showing how money grows, the whole reason why we're not in school right now has to do with exponential relationships. If you take a look at COVID-19, here's what we know about COVID-19. If the exponential nature of the infection transmission isn't stemmed in any way, let's say, for example, that will go on. So remember that this will continue for to double every 3 days. In other words, the doubling time for COVID-19 is only 3 days. So if you have 1,024 infected people, let's say on January 31st, now they just pick that day, 3 days later, you would double the 1,024 cases. So if you double that, you'd now have 2,048. But then 3 days later, on February 6th, that would double again to 4,096. 3 days later, it would double again. So after only 78 days, if you continued to double everything, you'd end up with 67 million people infected with the disease. That is if we did nothing at all. Went on as pretending life was normal. But we didn't. And that's why we don't have the 67 million people who are infected. So right now, we have only about 3 million confirmed cases. Why is that the case? Well, quite frankly, we have not been testing people. So what do the numbers really look like? Well, we will never know. However, in New York, they did a study, and this is a very common way of sampling data. They tested 3,000 random people, and they tested these people who were not sick and didn't think they were sick ever. And they tested these people's blood for the antibodies for COVID-19. After they tested 3,000 people, they noticed that roughly 13 to 14%, or they're rounding a little bit here, 1 in every 5 New Yorkers tested positive for the antibodies of coronavirus. So that means 1 in 5 people in New York who never thought they were sick actually carried the virus. So that means that there were as many as 2.7 million New Yorkers walking around who had the disease who never knew it. Now, luckily, they weren't walking around. Why weren't they walking around? Well, they weren't walking around because we had to. Everyone had to stay in their apartments. If they hadn't, that 2.7 million would have doubled every 3 days. It doesn't take long to figure out that this would have been a major catastrophe, which is why these drastic measures were enacted. And if we look at our graph, now this is the total cases and this is confirmed cases. So obviously we're still dealing with lack of testing here. But you can see how this growth of confirmed cases really matches the graph that we had right here. So you know what's going to happen if nothing changes. Well, March 14th, things started to change, didn't they? And that's why this curve did not continue. By us having to be indoors and not socializing, not doing what we normally do, this graph started to flatten. Now, has it gotten flat yet? No. We're still having increasing cases. However, it's increasing at a much slower rate because of these measures that have been put in place. So that's how exponential relationships match what's happening in the real world with us right now. Hope you found that somewhat interesting.